Well, guys, let me do a little bit of introduction stuff, and you know how it works. Put your questions in chat, and we'll field those in a bit. So we're going to do the Epistle of Barnabas rather rapidly, mind you, and then the partings. Notice the plurals, the parting of the ways. Notice the plurals. We'll come back to that soon. All right. The Epistle to Barnabas is one of the earliest post-New Testament document that actually deals fairly directly with Christianity and versus Judaism. And it basically says, haha, Christianity wins. And that's why it kind of leaves a bad taste, at least it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But anyway, the author is seeking to use allegorical interpretation of Scripture to show that the Christians are the true and intended heirs of God's covenant. I think he's right, but I think he misses some things that we're going to get in our historical development. It's fairly easy to outline. It is letter form in literary device. It's pretty clear. It's not really a letter. It's more of a tract. It's more of a treatise of some kind. But it's not unusual for some of these early documents, like Hebrews ends like a letter. Revelation kind of has letter forms at the beginning and the end. And so not unusual for early Christian literature. And so we've got a letter opening, and then we've got what we might call the polemical essay. That's where the author builds his case against Judaism as he experiences it in his day. And then the latter part of it is the two ways, which we discovered in the Didache, which also we know from, at least in embryonic form, we know it from the Gospel of John and from 1st and 2nd, 3rd John. There's a way of life and there's a way of death. And then there's the letter closing. So basically we have two large sections in this document. There is an apocalyptic perspective that the writer has. And by the way, I've pulled all of my little comments here from Mike Holmes' edition of the Apostolic Fathers, but he said it so well, I said, I can't say it better, so we'll just do it his way. And he says, the struggle between good and evil in the present evil age will soon come to an end with the arrival of the age to come. I would argue this is not quite the New Testament perspective, because in the New Testament, the age to come has already begun to dawn. So the way he's outlining history here, or at least his own circumstances, present evil age versus the age to come, and its accompanying judgment for which Christians must be prepared. Which is kind of typically New Testament, right? Jesus is coming anytime, kind of openness. But what I want you to catch is that this author is thinking in terms of an apocalyptic worldview. Evil's present, God will ultimately triumph, the end will come. With respect, and this is kind of the big case that's made in the document, with respect to Israel and God's covenant, the author of Barnabas asserts that Israel forfeited the covenant because of idolatry, disobedience, and ignorance. Having read the Mosaic laws literally rather than spiritually as intended, now he claims Christians are the true and intended heirs of God's covenant. And what's interesting about this, that again, I think Barnabas is showing us that place where that divide begins to really be felt. It leads into a rather unfortunate game of we're right and you're wrong. Are the Christians right? Well, we'll struggle with that one later. Let's talk about allegorical methodology. Allegorical methodology is we read a text and then the text means something very different. For example, the early Christians read the story of the Good Samaritan as if as allegory for the church, and the Samaritans represented the future church. I think so, in one writer, the donkey represents Paul represents Christianity, and donkey represents the church. And so it's basically kind of taking a text that can be read literally, but reading it symbolically. By the way, this is not unknown in the New Testament. Paul does this in Galatians, where he reads, "Are you the child? Are you the child of Hagar, or are you the child of Sarai?" By the way, somebody that you really want to know in background is a guy named Philo. Philo lived about the year 50. He's a contemporary of Paul. He's in Alexandria. He wrote lots of allegorical readings of the Old Testament, and those have survived. We do have them. You can read them. And so Philo is a great example of an early Jewish interpreter reading the Bible allegorically. And so in some sense, we read the Bible allegorically too, because when we hear the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, we hear the story of Jesus. That's probably a good illustration of how Christians tend to read the Old Testament. And we think it's the right reading when it applies, when it refers to Jesus. So Philo is an important writer, and his writings are still available. You can find them online or you can buy them. And there's a lot of them. So a lot of his writing has survived. By means of this allegorical approach, the author of the Epistle of Barnabas is able to offer a Christian interpretation of biblical texts that at first glance appear to have nothing to do with Jesus. And he gives an example from chapter 9, 7, and 8. And even to claim that only Christians understand the true meaning of Scripture. In short, Barnabas is a good early example of what became a dominant method of interpreting the Bible in the early and medieval church. And so as you're reading Barnabas, and as weird as it is, you're going to find that the early church often read lots of texts in this way. The Song of Solomon was a favorite, which is still a favorite for reading allegorically. I don't know too many Christians who stop at the literal reading, that it's actually about the beloved and the lover, that is actually kind of a wedding kind of a song, versus to reading it as applying to the church. By the way, this interpretation of reading the Song of Solomon as a reference to the church follows the example of early Jewish interpreters who also read it at that level, as in reference to Israel. Here's what we know about Barnabas. It's anonymous. We don't know who the Epistle of Barnabas, we don't know who it is. No clue. Connection to the historical Barnabas is unlikely, partially because the date tends to be a little bit later, but although we don't know, as you'll see. There is only one reference that we know of from the New Testament. You will find what looks like a reference to Matthew 22:14 in Barnabas 4:14, which might mean that it's quite early and that New Testament texts aren't circulating quite in the same way yet. I don't know what, but the only clear reference to the New Testament is this one in Barnabas 4:14.
Hey Stan, if you could give some a best author for Philo's readings, do you have one?
Oh, Philo is written by Philo.
But you said, are there compiled letters? Did an editor
No. They're not letters. They're actually teaching documents. They're tracts.
Okay, so someone that's interested would just Google that and then find those. Okay.
Yeah, just Google Philo and find out a little bit of history about him. I'm almost certain Paul would have known Philo, but obviously there's no reference to it. But he's a contemporary of Paul, and very good. This letter, or whatever we want to call Barnabas, I think possibly comes from Alexandria. And the reason we say that is because Alexandria is famous for allegorical interpretation of the classic literature of the ancient world. And so anybody that grew up in Alexandria would have naturally read allegorically, because that's how they're reading Homer and Hesiod and some of the other ancient literature. Another reason to think Alexandria might be the place this thing originates is that Clement of Alexandria. I think we're talking about the year 160 here with Clement. Clement is the earliest witness of Barnabas, and he quotes Barnabas quite often. So we know he's got a copy of Barnabas because he's quoting him. So what's the date? Well, there's nothing in it to actually date it solidly. So the references that are within the letter would suggest that it's after the destruction of the temple, which is mentioned, but it's before the city is rebuilt by Emperor Hadrian following the revolt of AD 32 to 136. So the city, the temple has been torn down, but nothing's been rebuilt yet. And so it would put it between 70 to 132. I'm thinking because of kind of the stark distinction between Christianity and Judaism, I'm thinking it's closer to 132 than it is to 70. Because we've got some examples of writings coming from near the year 70, namely Hebrews, that doesn't take this sharp break. So I would push it towards the 132 end. You know, when literature tends to deal with ideas rather than concrete historical stuff, it's really hard to date sometimes. So why was this thing written? Nobody's quite sure. Scholars have offered a number of things, and it usually falls into two categories. Either the motivation was internal, the Christians needing to define who they are against their environment, so it's an act of Christian self-definition, or it's external, that is, Judaism, however it existed where this writing was written, was actually perceived, it was a real or a perceived threat to the person who wrote it. And that's basically the kind of the two sides of anything of motivation. Is it internal? Is it something we need? Or is it external, something we're protecting ourselves against? Could be both. I wish we had more. Let me share you a little bit about how we know this document. This is the little piece that's probably boring to a good number of people, but I think is really important for us to understand how we actually get this document in front of us that we can read in translation. It comes from the fact that it's been preserved in manuscripts. And this one's rather interesting because it was preserved in a manuscript called Sinaiticus. Sinaiticus is one of our important manuscripts of the New Testament. It comes from the 4th century. It was discovered by Tischendorf at St. Catherine's monastery that's located in Mount Sinai. Thus, it's called Sinaiticus. But it's interesting because of the books it contains, in addition to what we normally would call the New Testament. And so this document is found immediately after Revelation, but before the Shepherd of Hermas, which, by the way, I'm just going to leave to you for your own study, and one we're not covering in this little mini-series. In any of the manuscripts, there's often correctors that have come along to correct, misspellings, text that might have dropped out in the transmission process, and they're nearly always signified with the abbreviation of a upper level or a raised or superscript S, and that simply means that we have Codex Sinaiticus, but we also have a number of correctors who've come in the manuscripts and they've put in a little bit of a different reading or things they thought were dropped or clarifications. And so they're often treated as if they're a separate manuscript because they give us a separate set of readings, but really it's just somebody correcting the manuscript in front of us. This other manuscript's been mentioned several times. This other manuscript, named after Jerusalem, by the way, don't let the H confuse you. That's actually a Latinized form of the word Jerusalem. I don't know much about the manuscript as others, but it dates to the year 1056. We know that because somebody put that in a colophon, that when they finished up a letter, they said, copied by so-and-so, in Jerusalem at this date. This is the one that was found in 1873 that contained also the Didache, 1st and 2nd Clement, and the longer form of Ignatius's letters. So those are the primary witnesses on which we gather together to create the text that gets translated. And there's a few more witnesses. There's a group of Greek manuscripts from the 9th, group of 9 from the 11th to 13. They're all derived from the same defective source, according to the source. I haven't had a chance to look at these manuscripts because this is not a place I'm going to dive deep. But there is also a single manuscript or papyrus fragment that contains 6 verses. There was a Latin translation that circulated, but apparently only with the first 17 chapters. It never seemed to have the chapters 18 through 21 as part of it. And then Clement of Alexandria, as we've mentioned before, has a large number of quotations, which allows us another source for how the text actually ought to read. So, by the way, this is true of the Bible or any other ancient literature. It comes to us because somebody copied it, and then we take the various copies and we kind of work together to figure out what the best readings are when you have variances in the manuscripts, which invariably you do because they were all handwritten. Okay, there's your quick kind of dirty look at Barnabas. Did anybody have anything in the text they wanted to say, hey, Stan, what does this mean? Or for me, at this point, I just want you to be aware that this document exists. I'm pretty certain you're not going to reference it often, but it does give us a point in history, and I would say around 132, in which the tensions between the Christians and the Jews as identifiable groups become really large. And so it seems to represent what I would call a pressure point in the history of the development of Christianity. Shannon, I got any questions waiting me?
Not yet.
All right, Annie, surely something just bothers you crazy about this document.
Well, funny that you should say that. I did, sorry to ask a question, but I did some reading around it, and it says that, is it possible that because of these really odd interpretations that the author seems to quote of the Bible, there were 3 possible theories put forward as to why he has these strange interpretations. And I just wondered a little bit about those and whether there was any fact to them. Like, for example, did he have a corrupt version of the Old Testament to hand when he was doing his interpretation? Was he poor at Hebrew because it's written in Greek? So did he just not understand what he was reading when he was reiterating some of those interpretations, etc.? So I wondered if you could just talk a bit about that at all.
Yeah, I would highly suspect this. There's no evidence that this was written in Hebrew originally, so it's Greek, and so he's probably using the Greek Septuagint. He's using the Greek translation of the Old Testament. My guess, here's what I'm going to suggest. This guy's a bit of an eccentric. He doesn't represent what I think is mainstream for the church, but he does represent for what will become a bit more mainstream in terms of the sharp line between Christianity and Judaism. Yeah. As I said, I don't think we know enough around this document to form too many theories. And so your scholars have basically tried to say, okay, here we've got this document. We can't quite put it in we don't even know what year it comes from. So what is it doing? I think it's an act of Christian self-definition and not an act to say we're not Jews. That is, that it's not the external threat that's really motivating this. It's kind of the internal need to try to define some things. And we can question how well the author does it, which I don't think he does it very well. But what's important for us also to know is that this document does have an influence on how Christians think later. And so it does, this kind of thinking does show up later. But I think that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, everyone, we could drill a lot deeper in all this material. I just want to give us a bit of a sampling along the way, but let me encourage you to do your own research. There's plenty of great research out there if you want to know more about it. So let me lead into a different conversation, one that I think will actually have some application to actually your reading of Scripture today. The book I would recommend, if you want the book that really drills deep in the various ways in which Christianity parts between its Gentile eventual form and the Jewish form of Christianity, this is This is the book. It's rather expensive, so you got to be a nerd. It's about $75 is what I looked at. So only if you really, really want to know this topic would I get this. But Dunn is a well-known British scholar. Everything he writes is one that I would say, yeah, you probably want to read him if you're really interested in this stuff. But he actually goes into all of the twists and turns. I'm going to give us kind of the quick and easy, kind of basic, but I hope complex enough to be fair version of this. But this is also confessing that Dunn's my source. So what I've done is I want to do kind of a historical journey that gives us signposts for where things are shifting and changing. And I want to start with the year 48. The year 49 is fairly significant because 49 is the date we normally give to the Jerusalem Council that happens in Acts chapter 15. And the decision is placed before the council that includes a largely Jewish contingent of the church. James is identified as the leader. And the decision before them is, are we going to demand that Gentiles adopt Jewish ritual in order to be followers of Jesus? And the church there, and I want to say it really strongly, the Jewish church there says it seems good to us in the Holy Spirit not to put these things on Gentile believers. By the way, they could have really slowed down the Gentile mission here by saying, no, everybody has to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. And so part of the debate that's going on here is a debate that we don't really have ears to hear, but it's about covenant. And there's two issues that are involved in covenant in relation to the Gentiles. One is, what does it take to get in the covenant? And what does it take to stay in the covenant? And I want you to know those are actually two different items that we kind of compress together. So just in very basic terms, what did it take to become part of the Jewish covenant? Birth within the Jewish family generally. Again, there were exceptions made for proselytes and others to join, but largely you were born in, and if you were a male, you were circumcised, which was, of course, the sign of the covenant. So that's what it took to get you into the covenant. Okay, what does it take to get Gentiles into the covenant? That's the debate of Acts chapter 15. And the decisive word is faith in Jesus is the determining factor. So the question that's being explored here is, what does it take to get in? Now, what does it take to stay in? Well, for both the Jewish covenant and for the Gentiles joining Israel in God's continued work, it's covenant loyalty. Okay, I just compressed a whole lot of scholarship into a really small place. So here's what I want you to think with me about. And this may be new thinking, it may not be, but if it is, give me a little allowance. I've been faithful to you all the way along this journey, so I'm not going to try to deceive you in any way. I want you to understand that the New Testament documents, virtually all of them, are inter-Jewish conversations. Okay, I'm letting that sink. Because what we do as Christians, now that we're 2,000 years removed, is we read these documents as exclusively as Christian documents. But in their original context, they are conversations between Jews who accept Jesus as Messiah and Jews that are having a hard time with it. Let me give you some illustrations to kind of show the point, and I've given you a list here. If Matthew is trying to tell the story to Gentiles, why does it continue the debate with the Pharisees? Matthew is actually shaped around debates with the Pharisees. In fact, it's almost And one way to look at it is it shows how Jesus and the Pharisees departed one another. By the way, when Jesus does the Sermon on the Mount, he's actually giving very Pharisaic type interpretations, although he's giving deeper interpretations. But they're still Jewish interpretation. He's still within a Jewish context when he does the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, Mark is the one that's often said is written to the Gentiles, and maybe, but why is it continually concerned about ritual purity? And what is clean versus unclean? Luke is actually, I think, one of the most helpful. Luke and Acts, his corresponding, is one of the most helpful documents for us to think about it, because he actually divides people between faithful Israel and unfaithful Israel, which, by the way, is a long established way of talking about Israel in the prophets. All the way back, if you may remember, all the way back to Moses, there has always been faithful Israel versus unfaithful Israel. And I'd like to suggest to you, although we are not going to be able to expand it, that for Luke, the church is, in Acts, is faithful Israel. It's not something new. It's a continuation of what God's always been doing. It's faithful Israel. And guess who that earliest church is composed of? Yep. That earliest church is Jewish. And so one of the challenges we have is that when we talk about Christianity, I'm not really sure we have a fully established system of religion that we can call Christianity in the first century. We have Jews who believe in Jesus who are inviting Gentiles into that same faith. Did I say that well enough? We have Jews who believe in Jesus inviting Gentiles to join them in it. Gives a rather different reading. John, the challenge with John is that John seems to be later, but the opposition seems to be with the Jews. Let me remind you, John is a Jew. So even these later writings seem to have this tension. The man who is blind in in John chapter 9 has been kicked out of the synagogue. We think that's what's happening to Christians at the time that he's writing this document, and why he uses that story. It's because there's Christians who are no longer welcomed, Christ believers, I might say, that are no longer welcomed at synagogue. Okay, Romans is a missionary letter designed to raise support between Jewish and Gentile elements of the church in Rome. And chapters 14 through 16 deals with how the weak and the strong is in this letter, the Gentiles who don't have the various scruples of the Jews, how to do this well. And so Paul's attempt there is to keep the church together so as to sponsor his mission trip to Spain. Galatians is very much about how one gets in. And it's through faith in Jesus, it's not through ritual law. Ephesians, the grand vision there is that Jews and Gentiles, that God has made peace with Jews and Gentiles, and out of the two have formed one new man. You'll find that developed in chapter 2 of Ephesians. Hebrews can be read very much like the Epistle of Barnabas, as it's an anti-Jewish story, but it's called Hebrews because it's written to Jewish Christians. And I believe Hebrews is written before the fall of Jerusalem and is getting people ready for all of the symbolic elements of Judaism to disappear. The temple, the priesthood, and all that. That's why all the way through the document, hey, you've got the real thing, you've got the better thing. The better thing, of course, is Jesus, which gives you better sacrifice, which gives you a better temple, which gives you a better Yom Kippur, or the celebration of atonement. And so I hope I've given you a little bit to suggest to you that what's going on in our earliest documents that make the New Testament is, in fact, this grand vision of somehow Gentiles being incorporated into Israel. In fact, that's how Ephesians words it, actually, that we are included in Israel. And so it does create, even Paul mentions at the end of Galatians, Israel, but it's pretty clear he means faithful Israel, those that believe in Jesus. Which of course makes some of the text really, really interesting to read. When you run across the word Israel in Paul's writing, you sometimes want to slow down and say, okay, Paul, what exactly nuance? Because he can use Israel in the literal sense of his people, his genetic people. All right, everybody feels blown away. Like, okay, Stan, you just caused me. We're going to have to reread the whole New Testament now. That's okay. That's what this course is called, right? Rereading. Let me do a little bit more building. In the year 62, at the end of the book of Acts, Paul has a conversation with the non-Jesus believing Jews. He has a conversation with the Jewish leaders in Rome, and at that point in history, you can go back and read this at the end of Acts, Christianity is still presumed by the Jewish leaders to be a sect of Judaism. Acts 28, almost at the end of the letter, or end of the book, you'll find Paul's conversation with the Jewish leaders. There has not been at that point any kind of what we might call a formal schism. And so the Christian movement, the Jesus believing movement, at this point doesn't really even have a name, although there's a couple of indications that outsiders call these folks Christians because they follow Jesus or they follow the Christ. But within the text of Acts, the preferred language is the way. For those of you watching The Mandalorian, this is the way. It's a good saying. Thank you, Laura. I know you understand what I'm talking about there. However, 2 years later, in the year 64, Nero will pick out the Christ believers and burn them at stakes. And so he will actually target the Christ believing segment of the Jewish religions. And so at this point, we've got Christians being identified as something other than Jews. Kind of an important point in history. Now, what you need to remember, this doesn't mean that this is empire-wide. It just means that in one particular locale, Rome, namely, the Christians are beginning to be identified as something a little different than the Jews. In the year 70, the fall of the temple has an incredible impact on the Christians or the Christ believers as well as the Jews. Jesus is presented in the Synoptic Gospels, all three of them, as predicting this event. It is an invitation by Jesus that when you see certain things becoming true, namely the army surrounding Jerusalem, you are to flee. Eusebius, church historian from the 5th century, will tell us that the Christians fled across the Jordan River to a place called Pella, so that there's actually a little bit of evidence that the Christ believers, who would have been greatly affected by this, particularly those that live in Jerusalem. By the way, the whole Christian movement would have been disturbed by this, because this is bigger than COVID, bigger than the Civil War, bigger than World War I and World War II for that time and for that world. This would have been kind of earth-shattering kind of events. And so the Christians would have been mindful and affected by all of this stuff, even though we think of losing the temple as being uniquely a Jewish problem. The early Christians, imagine being a Christian in those early years, knowing the temple was there and its great history. You would have loved the temple, although you might have interpreted it differently, but you would have loved the temple as much as the Jews. You're talking 500 years of history here just disappearing, 600 years. So there's no doubt that had a big impact on what happens to Judaism, because after this point, the Pharisees disappear and they become the rabbis. And so this is the marking point where we move from Pharisaic Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism. Somewhere, and this is a really confusing thing I'm about to share with you, but somewhere around 70, there are some 20, I think there's 21 benedictions, but the 18th benediction was added to the synagogue blessing. And it said this: for the apostates, I've given you the Hebrew there just because I could, let there be no hope, and uproot the kingdom of arrogance speedily and in our days. Maybe the Romans, may the Nazarenes and the sectarians perish as in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be written together with the righteous. You are praised, O Lord, who subdued the arrogant. Somewhere along the way in synagogue tradition, this was added, and it's pretty obvious that the Christians, the Nazarenes, notice that they're not calling them Christians, but they're almost still treating them like a sect. Obviously, you know where the name Nazarene comes from, right? Jesus from Nazareth. So nobody actually knows the full history of this, and it's really confusing, but somewhere along this time, the synagogue is actually making it part of who they are to exclude those who believe in Jesus. 70 may be too early, I don't know, but it's one of those signposts that something's happening between these groups. Sometime after the year 70, we get something like the Epistle of Barnabas. It's one of our signposts that things there's tension. Like I said, I'd rather keep that a little closer to 132, but in about the year, go ahead.
Are you able to answer Annie's question? Go ahead, Annie.
I can't answer Annie's questions. They're too deep.
Too many.
Ahead, Annie.
Yeah, are those benedictions, I don't know much about the Jewish faith, but are those benedictions still read in the synagogue today or upheld?
I don't know. I wouldn't be a bit surprised that you would find it in the Orthodox communities of faith, but certainly not in the liberal forms of Judaism today. So I don't know. It's worth asking.
Because that one is quite venomous in a way towards Christians, and therefore I would understand if you were in that community, you might actually think that Christians are pretty evil.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't gone deep enough to see how long that thing had survived or what I was really today just trying to figure out when does it start, and it's something around 70. But it also shows that my guess is that the Jewish faith will find the new Christianity threatening because it tends to take members from them. Remember, the earliest targets of evangelism in Acts are Jews. And Paul's methodology was always to start with the synagogue. Now, the reason Paul's doing this is because he thinks Jesus is the fulfillment of God's covenant. And so who do you start with? The covenant people. Let me continue to work us through our timeline. Annie, that's a great question. And again, like any one of these strands, you can almost spend a lifetime studying them. So, but let me encourage you, if you find anything of interest, chase it down, learn. Okay, somewhere around the year 110, Josephus's writings come to form, and Josephus wrote an account of the Jewish war. He wrote a retelling of the Old Testament. And so there's a lot of things that Josephus can help us with, but Josephus knows of the Christians. In fact, he mentions Jesus and John the Baptist and James. And so he does know of them, but he doesn't treat them as something different than Judaism, but simply kind of an odd thing that's happening within Judaism. In fact, Josephus tells most of his stories without reference at all to the Christian movement outside of the mention of Jesus, John the Baptist, and James. Let me change our geography now from Palestine back to Alexandria. In the year 115 to 117, 115 to 117, Trajan will have a campaign against the Jews that live in Alexandria. And it appears historically that this eliminated the Christians too. And the reason I say that is we do not have Orthodox Christians showing up again in history and literature until the year 180. And so it's as if we got this. By the way, one of the traditions about John Mark is that John Mark actually went to Alexandria or Egypt, and that he actually died being dragged behind a chariot in the streets of Alexandria. And so there's tradition that links the ministry of John Mark, the author of our gospel, to Alexandria. And then there's just a gap until the year 180. And one of the explanations for that gap is that when Trajan cleaned out the Jews in Alexandria, it caught obviously the Christians too, or the Christ believers among the Jews. In the year 132 to 136, you have kind of the mopping up of what seems to be the unfinished business of the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. Hadrian, the emperor now, Trajan's successor, will suppress Jewish insurrection known as the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Bar Kokhba is an individual who claims to have messianic pretensions. He claims to be the Messiah. At this point in history, the Jews are expelled from Jerusalem. I would assume that Christians probably were too, maybe. I don't know for sure. And the city was now known as Aelia Capitolina. It was given a pagan name and a altar to Jupiter, I think it was. I think I've got the right deity, was placed where the temple used to be. And so essentially the Romans seek to make Jerusalem into a pagan city. Okay, let me push this a little bit further down the historical timeline. In about the year 150, a character by the name of Marcion, in 144, in fact, he gave a large gift to the Roman church, and once they realized his intentions, they gave the gift back. So that's an early example of donor integrity. But anyway, Marcion rejected certain Jewish elements, including most of the Old Testament. He was one of the first early Gnostic reading. The God of the Old Testament was evil. The God of the New Testament was loving. We even feel that tension today as we try to relate the Old Testament to the Old Testament. He edited out as much of the Jewish elements in the New Testament, so he rejected basically every gospel except Luke, which I think is hilarious because it clearly shows me he's misreading Luke. He has 10 of Paul's letters, and he doesn't include any of the pastoral letters. But he's trying to create a canon that fits his conception of God, and it's not the evil God of the Old Testament is. So Marcion is important, maybe not hugely important, but he's important because Marcion also is one of our first insights into which books the early church are including as their canon. In fact, I think it's because Marcion was too narrow that the early church began to be more diligent about expressing which books they actually accepted. And now let me take you to the year 232. And of course, I would have to mention Origen. Those of you who know me knows that's my research guy. Origen and I have spent a lot of time together, even though he's been dead since 255. Origen has a school in Caesarea Maritima where he teaches philosophy as a means of helping pagans come to Christ. So he starts with philosophy to bring them to true philosophy. He's very much interested in the interpretation of Scripture. There is also, in Caesarea in the year 232, a rabbinical school there, a fairly important one. And so there is a Christian institute, Origen's school. There is a rabbinical institute there. One example of the intermingling between Jewish and what we might call Christian thought at this point is Origen's commentary on the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Song, appears much like the Jewish interpretation of the same books. So we've got interpretations of the Song of Songs from around the same period from both Jews and Christian. They're reading it pretty much different, except the Christians, of course, are reading Christ as a part of the way they read the story. And so by this time, I wouldn't say 232 is my date, but by the time we get to the 3rd century, it is pretty clear that Christianity is Gentile for the most part, and that Judaism is going its own way. And just to keep this from being terribly simplistic, the reason we want to call it the partings of the ways is because there are various strands of Jewish Christianity that live on for a couple of centuries. And the early Christians numbered these among the heretics. So as Christianity is becoming Gentile, when they look back on these various forms of Jewish Christianity, they're reading them as heretics. But here they are. The Ebionites appear to be a sect of Christianity, a Jewish Christianity, that saw their inspiration in James, but they didn't have much to do with Paul. They read Paul as if he was an enemy of Judaism. They continued Jewish practices like circumcision and other things. And when you think of the poor here, they're not only financially poor, but the way they're using the word poor is as it's used often in the Old Testament as the humble people before God. Then there was a group called the Nazarenes. I wonder who these folks were. I think maybe the folks mentioned in the 18th benedictions. They were living the law, but accepting Gentiles who did not. They tended to provide something of a middle ground. In fact, this may be the remnant, kind of what I would say, the real remnant of early Jewish Christianity coming from James, to be honest with you. Because what they're doing is basically living out Acts 15. Jews continue to be Jews, but Gentiles don't have to become Jews in order to become followers of Jesus. And then there was a group that's mentioned by Irenaeus and others called the Elkosites. These were Jewish Christians with Gnostic tendencies, which would have been more like Marcion, the evil God of the Old Testament and the good God of the New Testament. Flesh is bad, spirit is good, that kind of dualism. And they're named after a prophet that was named Elkosai. Sorry, I just kept typing there. I fixed that real quick. Elkosai. I share this last slide with you just to let you know, don't be simplistic in thinking that it's one kind of Judaism versus one kind of Christianity as they're beginning to separate out. In fact, in various areas, there's different little flavors of each of these as we go. And let me make one more book recommendation. If you love church history, or if I've done anything that would cause you to love Christian history, and you want to get one single book that'll help you capture the whole, this is it. I had Everett at Abilene Christian. He was one of my professors. And I can assure you, these are exactly the notes he shared with us in his classes. And so they're this book is probably one of the, if you're looking for crisp and concise, I don't have a lot of time to go deep, this is your book. And he does lay them out like course notes. So this is also the book we use, at least some of our professors use for the first part of church history when we do it here at Alberta Bible College.